Freedom of speech and opinion, academic freedom and fundamental human rights have remained the guiding principles of Namibia's political culture and governance. But Geingob disliked, some would say, being criticized in the media and often reacted rather dismissively and annoyed, seemingly. As an ardent football fan, he demanded play the ball and not the man. Veteran journalist Gwen Lister, founder of the independent local newspaper, The Namibian, and the author of Comrade Editor, knew the late president for over 40 years. And we now have the honor of her presence this afternoon. Good afternoon, Gwen, and welcome to this special tribute broadcast.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me. Nice to speak to one of the late president's favorite journalists.
I think you were absolutely the favorite. Yeah. Gwen, what were the circumstances under which the news about his death reached you?
Well, I was awake quite late on the Saturday night and having a look at the Twitter feed where I saw that rather controversial tweet saying that he'd been admitted to the ICU at Lady Pahamba and that his condition was stable but critical. And as it happened, I sent him a message at about 11 o'clock when I heard that. I sent him a WhatsApp and I said, look, you've crossed your rivers before, especially when it comes to health. I'm sure you're going to get through this one, and I look forward to having a cup of tea with you soon. Obviously, and rather sadly, that's a message he never got to read.
Sure. And then hours later, the news reached you that he had died.
Right.
Yeah. Were you in shock?
I think so, because whereas I think the presidency had been fairly transparent about the state of his health, I think they also underplayed the seriousness in that they kept referring to cancerous cells. And I mean, I think most people who read of that thought, okay, it's something that maybe chemo can take care of and he'll be back up on his feet again. So I think it came as something of a shock to hear that he'd been in the US for that special treatment and was rushed back only to die at home shortly afterwards. So I think it did come really as quite a shock to most of us. We did not anticipate it would happen that soon.
You knew him for over 4 decades, Gwen.
Right.
You've had a number of very interesting engagements with the late president. How would you describe him against the backdrop of the range of how interesting those engagements in fact were?
Well, look, I think first and foremost I would, and there are a lot of adjectives for the late president, but I think I would describe him as a larger-than-life character, always, and he was large in stature as well. He had a great sense of humor, he loved a good laugh, and he had a very infectious laugh. He loved a good party, especially back in the day. At the same time, he had a very fragile ego, and obviously he did like the good things in life. We all know that about the late president. But I think most importantly, he was a non-tribalist, and that's something that can't be said of many people in our political life these days. And I do believe he was a Democrat at heart.
When did you first meet him?
Well, I first met him in 1981 in New York. I think I'd gone over for a United Nations conference on Namibia, and I met him in New York at the SWAPO offices. Tell
us about that encounter.
Well, you know...
To the extent to which it's family-friendly, Gwen.
Exactly, and also the memory, of course. I often used to go to the US for various conferences and so on. And I do recall also being asked by, not so much Hage, who was more based in Lusaka than he was in New York, but he was quite frequently there. And I'd been asked, I think it was the first occasion I visited the US, and it might have been exactly that visit, where I'd been asked to bring mahango and ekaka and a few foodstuffs from home for the SWAPO delegation in New York. And being naive and being my first trip to the United States, I did so. Only on arrival to be completely bussed by customs,
sure,
who had all the dried ekaka all spread out in the mahangu, and of course all of it was confiscated, so I never got...
None of it reached any of them.
None of it reached the recipients, so yeah. So as I say, this was early days and getting used to meeting some of the leadership of SWAPO, and obviously Theo Ben-Gurion was there as well, and Hage Geingob at the time, and finding them very warm and very welcoming to this rather unknown at the time journalist from home.
How would you describe the relationship that he had with the media?
Well, it wasn't always a honeymoon, let's be quite honest. It was a sort of love-hate relationship at times, I think. I think President Geingob, and I mean, we'll be speaking about that probably more in depth, I don't think he disliked the media, but I think like most politicians, wasn't always happy with the probing eye of the media who were holding power to account or questioning his decisions and so on. But I think over the years, and I think it was a learning process, as was media freedom for most of us in those years from independence in 1990 to date, that slowly over time, President Geingob, who might not even have liked the media, even at the time of his death particularly, grew to acknowledge the importance of press freedom and free expression as an absolute fundamental of democracy. And also maybe first and foremost as something that Namibia really became renowned for. Press freedom, I think, is something that's certainly been one of our greatest achievements.
Let's dig deeper. So he's chairperson of the Constituent Assembly. And in our Chapter 3 Bill of Rights, freedom of the press indeed is enshrined. What does that say about his commitment not only to democracy in general, but certainly freedom of the press, freedom of expression in particular?
Well, as I say, back in 1989, when the Constitution was first drafted, and then in 1990, obviously, once it had been adopted and Namibia became independent, this was something of a first on the African continent. We all know that at the time, South Africa was still in the grip of apartheid. Press freedom certainly wasn't on the agenda there, but neither was it on the agenda further afield in Africa, where there were mainly at the time one-party states, and governments controlled most of the media, be it print or radio. There wasn't much television or certainly no online or digital media at the time, so government pretty much controlled media. So Namibia putting this in our constitution was definitely a first. And I think that is one of the reasons that Namibia, or Windhoek more specifically, was chosen for the UNESCO seminar on a free, independent and pluralistic press, which was held here in 1991.
You're preempting my next question,
Okay.
Gwen. You're jumping the gun. But thank you very much for that overview. So there may be viewers tuned in at the moment who
Right.
may be too young
Right.
to be aware of the Vuk Declaration. You were fundamental as far as that is concerned. President Geingob was the Prime Minister at the time.
That's right.
Please give us a broad overview of what had given rise to the Vuk Declaration, what its fundamentals were, and the role that our democracy, our capital city, played, not only as a host, of course, of the event.
Right. Well, to go back once again to our Bill of Rights, and to say that the press freedom that was enshrined therein was something that didn't just happen overnight. It's been a gradual process where I think most people, most politicians also have acknowledged the importance of press freedom. I don't think that was the case back in 1990. And I think our politicians at the time were still overly sensitive. They were still worried about a critical media. There were several incidents, I think, which showed they didn't like what the media was doing, holding SWAPO to account just as it came to power. So I think in 1991, the holding of that seminar, its significance, I think, was only realized many years later. We came up with, obviously, as you've alluded to, the Vuk Declaration on a free, independent and pluralistic press in Africa. And that was something of an achievement and a very historic fact, given what I told you earlier about the state of non-press freedom on the continent. So that was a big thing. Late President Geingob, who was then the Prime Minister, spoke at that seminar, as did the late Hidibo Hamatenya. And I remember at the time being fairly annoyed with both of them because they came up with the usual politicians speak of the press must be responsible. And I always hated that word, although I've always felt the press must be accountable. That word responsible always seemed to apply to the press, but never to their own selves and politicians in general. So I never liked that word. But as I say, these were early days, and we were in that learning curve on press freedom. As you know, the Vuk Declaration, which spoke for an independent press on the continent, was very significant to Namibia, as it would turn out. Some years later, the United Nations General Assembly recognized May 3, the day of its adoption in 1991, as World Press Freedom Day. And the declaration in Windhoek for Africa was followed by similar declarations all over the world. Sanaa in Yemen, Santiago in Chile, Alma-Ata in Kazakhstan. There were a number of declarations from countries coming out of the Cold War saying, yes, we want independent free press because it's an essential pillar of democracy.
Following the Vuk Declaration.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think at the time, everybody thought, oh, Vuk Declaration, nothing, no big deal. But I think latterly, and especially since we've celebrated the 30th anniversary of the Vuk Declaration and was happened here in our capital, it was a really big event, and I think recognized by our government and our president that that significance has not been lost on them.
Notwithstanding your observation that the late President Geingob had a love-hate relationship with the media, he stated at more than one occasion that as long as he is at the helm of the Namibian House, the press will be free.
Right.
What is also factually true at this moment is that Namibia tops press freedom on the African continent.
Right.
How much of that would you attribute to what he tried to do for press freedom?
Well, I think, again, as I said earlier, that significance of having that high ranking, according to the Reporters Sans Frontières Index, has become more significant over time, and certainly was significant to President Geingob. He knew when we slipped, I think, a couple of years ago from number 1 place to number 2, that probably a big part of the reason for that downward move was the fact that we had not yet passed an access to information law in Namibia. And so that became a priority where he certainly pushed his ministers to get that access to information law through Parliament, which was done in his term of president. So I think that became more and more significant to President Geingob. I always bemoaned the fact, and I spoke to him about it, I said, since Namibia has this pride of place as number 1 in Africa in press freedom rankings, why don't we use this to speak for press freedom when it's under fire further afield in Africa and elsewhere? But unfortunately, I could never get him to take that step to speak out where press freedom in other parts of Africa was trampled by
What was his
governments.
response when you did challenge him on that?
Well, I think it all dovetailed with the foreign policy, which I've always been pretty critical of Namibia's foreign policy. And I think it needs to be far more human rights-based than it is at present. It's kind of still stuck in the Cold War era of our allies back then, or still our allies today.
Although the point of departure is to respect the sovereignty of another state.
Exactly. But that, for me, does not preclude speaking out when rights are violated. I think Namibia has a very fundamental obligation, if you like, to do so, given that our own independence came about as a result of United Nations intervention, and that we chose specifically to put press freedom and other rights in our constitution, so why wouldn't we want the same for others?
Having seen, having witnessed various transitions of this country, both before 1990 and after that, how would you, as a veteran in the media landscape, remember his legacy in terms of the contribution to media freedom?
Well, I think, again, President Geingob came on board. We've obviously had many interactions in my time as a working journalist. Not all of it was good. We had a number of set twos at times. We agreed at times, but we also did have our moments of conflict. But I think when it came to press freedom, President Geingob came on board. And I remember when we launched the Code of Ethics, for Namibian media, because we were obviously strong believers in self-regulation of the media. President Geingob, I don't think, always believed that back in the day, but he came to believe that self-regulation was more important than government regulating the media, and there were other forces at work who wanted government to control the media. So I think President Geingob, by making that commitment to launch the Code of Ethics for us, put his stamp also on the importance of self-regulation, and eventually, as you know, the Namibian media appointed an ombudsman and so on, which the public could complain to where they felt their rights had been violated. So I think that was a big contribution. And again, I think he was very conscious all the time of Namibia's top ranking in the Press Freedom Index, and wanted to keep it that way, because he did, as you say, make an active commitment to say, as long as I'm president, journalists will not be arrested and there will be press freedom. And I think he held true to that promise.
What will you miss most about him, Gwen?
It's difficult, because I think most of us, especially who've known him for so many decades, still find it hard to believe he's gone. We're still trying to come to terms with, as I said earlier, his larger-than-life presence, where one would sometimes argue with him, sometimes agree with him. But I think I would miss the fact that even though I probably saw more of him pre-independence than I did after, because I've never been sort of in the corridors of power very much since then, but he was at the same time accessible. And I do remember Press Freedom Day a couple of years ago, where we had invited a Zimbabwean journalist to come and do a workshop. And this Zimbabwean journalist was stuck at Hosea Kutako Airport. They would not let him into town. It was a whole thing. He spent several hours sitting there and was not allowed to come into town. When I heard about this, without delay, I picked up the phone and I called the president and I said, President Geingob, this is unacceptable, and it is certainly something, if it gets out into the public domain, that this journalist has not been allowed to come for the occasion of World Press Freedom Day, whatever the issues may be with work permits and whatever, that it's going to reflect very negatively in the next index.
You said that to him?
I said it, and without hesitation, it was a matter of minutes before he said, Gwen, I will immediately deal with it. And the journalist was in town within the matter of an hour. So there were areas where I felt, when it came to our image in the outside world, when it came to issues of press freedom and my concerns around possible violations, that he was always ready to step in and do the right thing.
Gwen, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your continued contribution to this great republic.
Thank you.